For centuries, really, this fundamental question has been floating around. How did we, humans, actually develop language? I mean, philosophers, psychologists, medical experts, everyone's had a crack at it.
It's a massive question.
Sure.
We have a rough idea, Homo sapiens, maybe 100,000 years ago. But the specifics, how it all unfolded, that's still quite the puzzle.
Right, and that's exactly what we're diving into today. We've pulled together some really interesting recent articles, bits of research, trying to map out that evolutionary journey.
We have. We'll be looking at, well, genetic clues, some of the big physical changes in our anatomy, and even theories about communication before language as we think of it now.
Exactly. And for you listening, we know you want to get the insights, get them quickly, but also properly understand them. So our mission here is simple. Pull out the really crucial stuff from these sources.
Give you the surprising bits, a clear picture, hopefully, without getting bogged down in every single tiny detail.
Okay, so where do we start? Maybe with the idea that language isn't just about speaking.
That's a great starting point. This concept of modality independence, it basically means human language isn't tied to speech alone. Think about sign languages.
Okay.
They aren't just, hand waving. Sign languages used in deaf communities are incredibly complex. They have all the major properties of spoken language, grammar, vocabulary, the works, just a different channel, visual instead of auditory.
So structurally, deep down, they're just as sophisticated as, say, English or Japanese.
Absolutely. And it shows something amazing about our brains, right? The language centers seem to work just fine whether the information comes in through the ears or the eyes.
Mhm.
We see it in deaf communities, obviously, but also in some hearing communities, like certain Australian Aboriginal cultures that use sign versions of their languages for specific situations. It really underlines how flexible human language is.
That's fascinating. Okay, so moving from the how we express language to
Yeah.
the actual, physical equipment, our speech organs. It's kind of weird to think they weren't originally for talking.
It is, isn't it? Lips, tongue, vocal tract, they started out doing basic survival stuff. Eating, breathing,
Right.
take the tongue. For most primates, it's mainly about moving food around. But humans, we have this incredible fine-tuned control for making speech sounds.
And we can juggle both, right? Eating and talking, although maybe not the exact same second.
Well, yeah, we coordinate them in a way other mammals don't seem to. Which brings us to the vocal tract itself and whether ours is, special.
Ah, the descended larynx thing, where ours sits lower down compared to other primates.
Exactly. That gives us a longer pharynx, which acts like a resonance chamber, letting us make a wider range of sounds. But there's a downside.
Choking, right. It increases the risk because the paths for air and food cross lower down.
Precisely. So the big question becomes, was the need for complex speech the main reason this risky anatomical change happened?
And the timing is a bit tricky there, isn't it?
It is. These big changes to the vocal tract probably took a very long time to evolve. Maybe starting way back with Homo erectus 1.6, 1.8 million years ago, tied to things like walking upright and skull changes.
But complex speech, like we have, is thought to be much more recent. Like with us, Homo sapiens, maybe 100,000 years ago, give or take.
That's the general consensus, yeah, though some genetic dating pushes it potentially earlier. But still, there's this gap. It makes it hard to argue that the immediate need for speech was the sole driver for all that intricate vocal anatomy evolving. Other factors were likely involved over a long stretch of time.
Okay, so we've got these adaptations in humans. What about our cousins, the Neanderthals? What could they do? The picture seems to be changing there.
It really is. The evidence is mounting that they likely had speech capabilities pretty similar to early modern humans. I mean, look at their sophisticated tools, their hunting tactics that suggests complex communication was needed.
And there are genetic clues, too.
Yes, the FOXP2 gene. We know it's linked to coordinating the mouth and face movements for speech in us. Well, it turns out Neanderthals had the same version we do.
So that old idea about them not being able to speak properly because of their hyoid bone, that's out.
Largely, yes. That theory was based on the idea their hyoid bone, that little U-shaped bone in the neck, was positioned high up, like an ape's. But then they found a Neanderthal hyoid bone in Kabara cave,
And it looks like ours.
remarkably similar to a modern human one. Now, there's still some debate about exactly how tightly hyoid shape links to larynx position, but it strongly suggested they could have had a descended larynx.
And there's more, right? Something about their ears.
Uh-huh. Studies on the ear bones of proto-Neanderthals from Atapuerca in Spain showed their hearing range, their auditory sensitivity, was basically in the same ballpark as ours. They could likely distinguish the subtle sound differences crucial for speech.
Wow. So physically equipped, genetically potentially equipped.
It seems increasingly likely. Oh, and remember that research on the hypoglossal canal, the hole at the base of the skull for the tongue nerve?
Yeah, that was thought to be an indicator for speech timing.
It was, but further research showed it's not really a reliable marker for that specifically. So another piece of the puzzle that shifted.
Okay, so let's move to some of the newer genetic stuff. This NOVA1 protein variant, that sounds pretty significant.
It is, yeah. This comes from research out of Rockefeller University. They found a specific genetic variant in NOVA1. It's an RNA binding protein involved in brain development.
Right, RNA carrying the instructions. NOVA1 helps manage the messengers.
Okay. And this particular version, this variant, is found only in modern humans. Neanderthals and Denisovans didn't have it.
And when they put the human version into mice,
They saw changes in the mice's vocalizations. It didn't make them talk, obviously, but it altered their sounds in suggestive ways. It points towards this gene variant playing a role in how our vocal communication evolved.
and it's common in humans now.
Incredibly common. They looked at huge numbers of human genomes, and almost everyone has this variant. That strongly suggests it conferred some kind of evolutionary advantage related to vocalization.
What's really striking, though, is how specific its effect seems to be.
That's the kicker, yeah. It seemed to mostly affect other genes linked to making sounds without having a huge impact on RNA binding for general brain development or motor control stuff.
So not just making brains bigger overall, but fine-tuning something specifically related to speech.
That's what it looks like. It suggests the evolution of speech might have involved these kinds of targeted genetic tweaks, not just, broad changes. It's a really exciting new piece of the puzzle.
Okay, no VA1 is the new kid on the block. But what about FOXP2? That was the famous language gene for a while.
It certainly had its moment in the spotlight, and it is important. It's involved in brain development early on, and we know mutations cause severe problems with the muscle control needed for speech.
And humans have a couple of unique changes in our FOXP2 compared to chimps, for instance.
We do. 2 amino acid substitutions that seemed pretty significant. But here's the twist.
Neanderthals again?
You guessed it. Turns out Neanderthals also had those exact same 2 substitutions.
Ah, so those changes must have happened before our lineage split from the Neanderthal-Denisovan one?
Exactly. It means those specific FOXP2 changes, while important, probably aren't the key to what makes human language unique compared to potential Neanderthal communication. It's a good reminder that the story is usually more complex.
So later research kind of dampened the idea that FOXP2 was under strong selection, specifically in Homo sapiens.
Yes, studies looking at broader population genetics and the ancient DNA suggest that might not be the case. Its role is undeniable, but maybe not the single smoking gun for uniquely human language evolution we once thought.
Are there other genes people are looking at?
Oh, absolutely. The field is very active. Researchers are investigating other candidate genes, especially ones involved in things like epigenetic regulation, controlling when and how genes are turned on or off, and other aspects of early brain development. It's a tangled web.
Okay, this is super interesting on the biological side. Let's switch gears a bit. What about this, hypothesis, the singing Neanderthals idea?
Ah, yes, Stephen Mithen's proposal. It's quite a different take. He suggests that before structured language, hominins, including Neanderthals, might have used a communication system he calls, right, holistic, multimodal, musical, and mimetic.
Okay, break that down. Holistic, multimodal.
Holistic meaning maybe utterances didn't break down into small, meaningful parts like words, but conveyed whole messages. Multimodal means using everything voice, gesture, body language. Mimetic involves imitation. And crucially, musical relying heavily on rhythm, pitch, melody, maybe timbre, to convey emotion and meaning.
So less about precise words, more about emotional expression through song-like sounds and gestures.
Kind of, yeah. Mithen argues this could explain that paradox we mentioned Neanderthals seeming physically capable of speech, but the archaeological record lacking clear signs of symbolic language. A musical emotive system like might not leave those kinds of traces.
He even mentioned sound synesthesia, like matching sounds to sizes.
Yeah, the idea that maybe certain types of sounds were instinctively linked to certain physical properties. It's speculative, of course, but an interesting part of the hypothesis. It definitely makes you think about the potential deep links between music and language origins.
It's a cool idea, but controversial, I imagine.
Oh, definitely. Linguists especially raise questions like how do you define music in that context? And could a system without symbols and grammar really handle complex communication needed for tool making or coordinated hunting?
Right. How do you convey, we need to sharpen the flint on the north side of the river tomorrow?
Exactly. The feasibility of it as a complete pre-language system is debated. But even with the criticisms, it's a valuable idea because it forces us to consider that the path to language might not have been linear, and maybe things like musicality played a really central role early on.
Okay, so we have genes, anatomy, theories about pre-language.
Hmm.
What about the timeline? When did all this happen? That seems like the hardest part to figure out.
It really is. Speech doesn't fossilize, unfortunately. So researchers have to use indirect methods, which always come with uncertainties.
Like looking at modern language diversity.
Right. Johanna Nichols did work suggesting that the sheer diversity and geographical spread of languages today implies that vocal languages must have started diversifying at least 100,000 years ago, possibly earlier.
And there was that idea using phonemes, the basic sounds of a language, like a phonemic clock.
Yeah, the theory there was that maybe older languages accumulate more phones over time. Some studies using that approach pointed to an origin in Africa, maybe 150,000 to 350,000 years ago, roughly when Homo sapiens emerged.
But that idea has problems too.
It does. Linguists have pushed back quite strongly. For one, the analogy between genes and phonemes is shaky languages borrow sounds from each other all the time. Gene flow between species is much rarer. Plus, there are issues with sampling. You find languages with lots of phonemes and few phones scattered all over, and it might reflect recent contact or drift rather than just deep history. The link between population bottlenecks and phone numbers is also debated.
So interesting idea, but maybe not a reliable clock. What about pushing the timeline even further back, based on anatomy?
Well, as we touched on, if things like changes in Broca's area in the brain or the beginnings of vocal tract reshaping due to bipedalism started much earlier, maybe with Homo erectus 1.6 million years ago,
Then maybe some foundational elements for language were starting to emerge way back then, especially if they were developing more complex tools needing to pass on that knowledge.
that's the argument. It suggests a really long, slow fuse for language evolution, with different pieces falling into place over literally millions of years, rather than the sudden recent invention.
It really does paint a picture of gradual change. And, throughout all this, we can't ignore the social side, can we? Language doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Absolutely not. The heartbreaking cases of feral children deprived of language input early on show just how crucial social interaction is. Our brains seem wired to expect, even need, language exposure for normal development.
You see it in kids learning to talk, right?
Yeah.
That progression from single words to little phrases to complex sentences happens so fast, but it relies on that back and forth with caregivers.
Totally. Active interaction is key. It's not just passive listening. And that interaction shapes language development profoundly.
Which brings us, maybe finally, to comparing us with other primates and this idea of early sign language.
Right. When we look at non-human primates, their vocal communication tends to be, well, simpler in structure. Often single calls linked to specific things, danger, food, rather than the complex sequences we use.
And the sign language idea. People have suggested early humans used gestures before speech, pointing to things like message sticks or Plains Indian Sign Language.
Those examples are sometimes brought up, yeah. But there are counter-arguments. There's really no solid archaeological evidence for ancient, complex sign languages in the way linguists define them. And some critiques point out potential biases like ableism or autism in assuming sign must have preceded speech.
So, while gestures were almost certainly part of early communication,
True sign languages, with their own grammar and vocabulary, likely arose more recently, specifically when deaf individuals formed communities, like the fascinating case of Nicaraguan Sign Language spontaneously emerging, or historical deaf villages where signing became the norm for everyone.
so it's probably not accurate to equate early gesturing with fully formed sign language systems.
Probably not, no. It's more complex than that.
Wow.
Wow.
So wrapping this all up, it's clear the evolution of language was and is incredibly complex.
Definitely. We've touched on genetic factors like NOVA1, the anatomical shifts in our vocal tract may be driven by multiple pressures.
That really intriguing idea of a musical proto-language, and the ongoing debates about when language actually emerged, whether it was relatively recent or has much deeper roots.
And for you, the listener, the main takeaway is probably that while the precise origin story is still shrouded in mystery, Looking at all these different lines of evidence gives us these really fascinating glimpses into the journey.
It shows how this ability that so defines us came to be. It wasn't one thing, but this convergence of biology, behavior, and maybe even music.
Absolutely.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with. Just consider how this picture is constantly evolving. Every new fossil, every genetic discovery, every linguistic analysis potentially adds another piece or changes the perspective.
Right. What will the next decade reveal? It makes you think about that deep interplay between our genes, our bodies, our brains, and crucially our social worlds in shaping the incredible diversity of languages we speak or sign today.